And you just said right now that that 50% of the American public, right, doesn't even know who Assange is. And this is something that Diego and I both experienced at USC, which Diego studied and I'm studying at right now. We're in the journalism or Annenberg journalism program, and you know, there next to none of the people that I know in class, and I think that Diego knew in class, um, know who Assange is. I personally haven't met anyone that does. And what does that say about like our current political and media climate that in a journalism school that, kids are supposed to be politically active? It's apparently the number one school in the country. What does that say that none of these kids even know who Assange is?
Yeah, he's one of the most prominent political prisoners of the 21st century. And perhaps he's not as well known as someone like Mumia Abu Jamal or Leonard Peltier, who come from the 20th century. Of course, they've been imprisoned unjustly for decades. And yet, uh, nobody really knows of Julian Assange, at least to the extent that you would think, given the media attention that has been given. I've seen, I this is my everyday life to cover this beat and know what is happening in the Julian Assange case. So I don't know how somebody doesn't see coverage, but then I think about what media people tend to consume, and it's not a recurring news headline on MSNBC. It's not a recurring news headline on CNN. Sometimes it breaks into Fox News, but it's not really about news. It's about how can we own or show you that Joe Biden and Attorney Merrick Garland are terrible. So it feeds the culture war. So they just talk about Julian Assange in order to show that the liberals are terrible people. And in this instance, they are fairly terrible because they have allowed this to unfold and they don't seem to have principles that support the First Amendment unabashedly, no matter how they view Julian Assange. They've been willing to allow this to continue. But I think it also says something about the propaganda that has been leveled against Julian Assange. And I think this is one of those instances where we can treat this as like a glass half full or half empty. And it's like what I said. Do you choose to be cynical and say that we have no power to change the future of this case? Or do you have some optimism? And when you look at the fact that the character assassinations for over a decade have been relentless, and yet half the people haven't heard those. So those people in your class who don't know who Julian Assange is, the one good thing is they haven't heard the stuff that is intended to poison people's minds about Julian Assange. So you still have an opportunity to inform them that Julian Assange published these documents. They were about the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. These were wars of occupation. These were wars that killed, at least in Iraq, there were probably 1 million civilians who were killed. And in Afghanistan, look at what's been unleashed now. The Taliban took control of Afghanistan after the US withdrew. And right now, there are sanctions and there's untold suffering with mass starvation being inflicted by the US government. And those are all extensions of policies that the US had incorporated into its war making for the last 2 decades. And you could tell them about where Julian Assange fits in. You can maybe mention some of your favorite revelations from the US diplomatic cables because of what they meant to you. Maybe you're into Latin American politics. Maybe you follow what goes on with countries in the Middle East or North Africa, whatever is your interest. Maybe you're super terrified, as I think all people should be, about what is happening with the war in Ukraine, since it is something that has so many ripple effects in the global economy, and it impacts not just the West severely and in Europe, but it's having a large impact on countries in the global South. And you want to reference some of the cables about Russia and NATO, including the one from CIA Director Bill Burns that pointed to what Russia's hangups and discontent, how it came from being encircled from NATO forces. and how they felt that was a reneging on promises from history. And you can share that with others and let them know. And then that gives us the potential to actually start and engage more people in challenging the Julian Assange case. So I think that gives us reason to be optimistic. You know, the failure of that propaganda to reach more of the US population is good. But I will say that obviously the ignorance is something that is helpful to the US Justice Department, because if you have almost half of the population that just doesn't even care what prosecutors do to Julian Assange, then they get to keep him in limbo and punish him by process over in the UK. And then obviously there will be more punishment when he's brought to the US, because the trial will probably take at least 1 to 2 years before we have any outcome.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned Fox News before. They were actually, seemed like they were one of the only mainstream outlets to cover this passing rally. And it's just funny because even when you have stories like the CIA's attempted kidnapping and assassination of Assange that was reported by Yahoo News, that didn't even get really much attention. Sure, what might have been reported here and there, but it's such a huge thing. It didn't make news like that. But it's funny, like, yeah, I understand for sure that Fox News can be cynical at and they would report on this because it helps them and it makes liberals look bad. But at the same time, to report on this is also helping themselves, right? Because this precedent that's being set with this case affects all journalists, and it effectively could make journalism illegal to an extent. So it's what do you think of do you think it's all cynicism, or do you think that people like Tucker Carlson report on these things because there also stands to have that precedent in the future?
When those publications came out in 2010 and 2011, Fox News was extremely angry and upset with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. This was a network that called for things like sending in a drone to strike and kill Julian Assange. So it's hard to believe that, and Tucker Carlson was working and was part of the Fox News family back then, and he didn't have any good words for Julian Assange. So we do think it's all about politics. But look, at the grassroots level, people who are going to just turn on their televisions and watch, I don't think they have the kind of sophisticated understanding that we're trying to apply to this, where they think about, oh, why is Tucker Carlson saying this thing today? I just think they're happy to hear something like that. And if it resonates with them, then those words make sense and it might motivate them to investigate and look into the issue. So if that's what you're getting at, I agree with you that more than anything, we need these cable news networks to cover the case. And just as we need these major print publications to use their websites and use their papers to publish developments in the story. I mean, we're not seeing people report that Julian Assange got COVID. That's not something that's making big headlines. We just hear Stella Assange tell her followers on Twitter, and it doesn't necessarily translate into major news. It's not like you saw a CNN breaking news headline like that could be a bad thing for the future of Julian Assange. Like you say, this is a big moment, I think, in the past week where people organized and we had that demonstration in London, but it wasn't at any time during the weekend referenced on CNN that I know of. And it definitely didn't make it into MSNBC's coverage. So it falls on independent news journalists or alternative news sites like ScheerPost and us to make sure that we all get this out to people, but we have a very limited reach. Although there are some shows on YouTube that have covered this that have been able to push Julian Assange's name into people's vision so that they are engaged. I also want to caution that, like, we spend a lot of time thinking about where our work goes on this, and it's probably more useful to talk about the case itself and use the moments when we're creating media to engage in the case. So, I always get this question of why aren't more people covering the Julian Assange case? And it's awkward because I say, well, I'm reporting on it. I'm doing this work every single day, and it's out there and it's available. And I understand that some people may not know that it's out there, but it's kind of an awkward thing to be asked why journalists aren't covering when I'm a journalist and I'm covering Julian Assange's case. And so I think that we kind of have to walk and chew gum at the same time. We critique the media, but we also have to know what media is covering Assange, and we have to keep boosting that work and sharing it. And we can't just be hyper focused on how Jim Acosta of CNN is only upset with attacks on journalism when it involves Donald Trump, but he doesn't care if the U.S. Justice Department is prosecuting Julian Assange.
You're working on a guidebook right now in the hypothetical case that Assange is extradited to the U.S. I was wondering if you could give us a peek into what to expect from that, maybe some of the guidelines that you offer, and also you just said that it's important we talk about the case. If there's any new updates that you'd like to talk about in the case.
Yeah, thanks. So this book, which is out in February 21st, I organized it thematically by issue, and my intent was to try and get it beyond just the group of people who have been engaged in my journalism, but also to recognize that these are very complex issues. There's a lot of intricate aspects to this, and to peel it layer by layer and help people to understand. So rather than tell people the story chronologically, I go issue by issue. So we're looking at the FBI's role, or we're looking at the CIA's role. We're looking at what certain media outlets have done to aid and abet the prosecution. We look at what the US government's attitude was towards WikiLeaks back in Chelsea Manning's court-martial. We look at Chelsea Manning's court-martial to see how the US government prosecuted her, because a lot of the case that is being brought against Julian Assange has overlap between the two. So Chelsea Manning's case is in some ways dusted off and reworked and revamped, and then it is deployed against Julian Assange as if he's a co-conspirator of Chelsea Manning. And so those details are important as we understand the lies, the distortions, the misinformation that is inherently a part of the Justice Department's effort to bring a journalist to trial. And I'd give you this update that, right now there are 2 pending appeals in the High Court of Justice, which is like an appeals court. And we are waiting to find out what the High Court will do, whether they will hear them. One is against the Home Office, which the Home Secretary at the time that approved the extradition was Priti Patel, this figure who was pretty repellent. She, at the time, in her final days in the office, she was mired in this scandal that involved deporting Rwandans from the UK in mass, or deporting people to Rwanda. And so she's someone who campaigned or was working in her position to actually protect national security, state secrets over journalism at the expense of freedom of expression. And then, so there's that appeal. And then there's another appeal that is about Judge Vanessa Baretzer's decision, the one that ended up being upheld and approved to the Home Office. So that means that now we're going to have these larger issues that we might be able to hear in court, challenging the way that the court never upheld that Julian Assange has rights as a journalist, the freedom of press issues, that the extradition law was interpreted incorrectly by the court because they didn't think of this thing called political offenses. how espionage in most countries, if a government accuses you as a citizen of espionage, but you're in another country and they want to extradite you for espionage, that's political. And oftentimes governments won't hand that person over because they know that like espionage might not be espionage in their country, because they may not care that like you have acted in that manner. So those are things that need to be weighed and discussed, and we'll find out if he's going to get a hearing in the appeals court. And then I'll just mention that we have this pending lawsuit against spying on journalists and against lawyers that were representing Julian Assange, who visited him while he was in the Ecuador embassy. And it's against Mike Pompeo, former CIA director, in his capacity as a private individual. And it's against the CIA because we have this evidence through reporting from the Yahoo News, from El País in Spain, that the Spanish private security company UC Global was passing along audio and video surveillance through their work at the Ecuador embassy that gave the CIA access to private communications, private video, private audio, that allowed there were dossiers that were being put together on those who visited. So there was an espionage operation that was conducted against those in the embassy that visited, and it targeted, the lawyers estimate that over 1,000 US citizens potentially were targeted by this surveillance that was CIA backed, and that they should be challenged for violating people's Fourth Amendment rights to privacy, which do not cease to be enforced because they are visiting the Ecuador embassy in London. They still should be protected. So those are things that I think those who follow ScheerPost should be looking for in the near future.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Kevin, for joining us on the channel, and we really appreciate the work that you do, and we hope that we can have you back on soon to keep up with this case and keep the fight on.
Well, thank you. It was good talking to both of you.